live streaming. So yeah, welcome, and the word back to you.
Thank you very much. And I see people are still coming. I see Rami, Jenny, Tomasz, welcome. And but I'd like to proceed with today's session. Allow me first to do a really quick overview what is happening or what is waiting for us today. And then we will go straight to our exciting guests. So today's Ecocivilisation talk is part of the broader Ecocivilisation think tank activities. Just briefly, if you are interested in any other aspects and areas of engagement, please join us also for Ecocivilisation in Action and Global Open House and Year of Ubuntu, which are all elements of Ecocivilisation movement. There is a slight mistake here. Ecocivilisation in Action is on the Pinamaya.
12th of April.
Thank you. So today we are really addressing an important topic, which is politics and ecocivilization. The key elements that we will explore today together with our guests is if we can imagine a fresh political structure that can actually improve the participation of citizens, that improve transparency and support reflections, which then can lead to sustainable prosperity. Then if we can find a way to connect and create a global alliance to change the political landscape on a local and global level, and if we can attract leaders with the capacity to see, understand, engage, deliver, mobilize, lead in a more network-based world, which embraces the capacity and competence of each individual. In order to do that, I would like to first just quickly go through the key points that we were able to pull together in the first two sessions this year. I think they really set the framework for the whole year of talks, which is, by the way, the second year that we are engaging with you. So ecocivilization, it's becoming clearer and clearer as our joint possible destination. Ecocivilization just might be the ticket of our existence, emerging from a rising awareness and a higher density of global consciousness, calling for higher respect of the laws of nature, humanity, and better interaction. In the first two talks, we dived really deep into the roots of civilization, looked at the reasons for their rise and fall, discussed the weak signals and leverage points that could help us to sense when our civilization, like 28 others before, those, of course, that we are aware of, is going to be challenged, or even when it will start falling, or maybe it is already happening. We have also concluded that one unique element of our civilization are information in real time. So are we capable of using them, and instead of falling as a civilization, find the energy and strength to reinvent ourselves and transition into the new civilization? So the conclusions was that we need to join forces globally and develop models that can cope with VUCA conditions, volatile, complex, and ambiguous conditions in a much better way. And this year is dedicated to that, to see if we can do and engage better. So the challenges ahead of us are the political landscape is today challenged all over the world. We see it in all parts of this planet. Fake news, manipulation, and the deterioration of democracy have been basically a daily practice, not only on the West, but all over the world. And one of our today's guests already provided me with a very interesting information that today only 6% of global population lives in a stable democracy. So that is a big call for serious discussion and engagement. Yet everyone, and I hope I can speak for you as well, who ever experienced freedom and an open society based on the rule of law, respect and collaboration, knows how dark the world without this actually could be. So let's join now our strengths and resources to give democracy a new push, to reinvent it and readjust to the needs of today's society and challenges before it becomes just a blink in the history of this planet Earth. I'm sure that the energy that we have, people of goodwill and positive attitude to life, we have also capacity to reinvent ourselves. But without further ado, it's time to invite our guests because they will expand our minds. And as I've learned from the youth, when you expand your minds, you have a capacity to see more and to solve new problems and challenges and address opportunities. So I'm inviting, with that in mind, I'm inviting our first two guests who are with us already for the third time. These are Stefan and Alexander. I don't think I need to introduce them to you too much, but I will not actually introduce any of the guests today through their CVs. We published them and we hope you had a chance to take a look at them, but if not, please do it because they really have exciting stories to tell. And now Alexander and Stefan will bring us a system view. They're both global system scientists, very established professionals and researchers. And we'd like to see what is their point of view on the political situation and how can system science help us to see the solutions better and opportunities as well. So Alexander and Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Violetta. Thank you for the invitation, ongoing. Today it is the most challenging topic for me, I guess, for many reasons. It is, I won't say the most complex, but most difficult system to address. Also from a direct experience in locally as well as in European and global initiatives. But I will try to contribute some of the thinking I have developed during these couple of years on this issue. Some of them are more informed by science, some are more informed by, let's say, my personal experience, and then I would rather call them an opinion than a scientific fact. But from science, I think it is very interesting to look at this matter from a systems perspective, as politics or the political system is not, as any other system, is not independent, but largely interdependent. So the way we're doing politics today is so context sensitive to, as we have also explored in the last two sessions, from socio-historical point of view, but also from the this is now the system science framing from embeddedness and nested systems point of view, where you have environmental conditions which lead to social systems conditions and structures, and then out of these social structures we develop our political structures. if any of these change, the political systems change, rather than the political changes anything of the social structure or the environmental structure, which is very interesting in its feedback loops. So, for instance, nowadays we can experience it directly. Unfortunately, when it goes through environmental changes, maybe the climate crisis, but now the pandemics, where our social structures are heavily under pressure. And the pressure is also being responded and reinforced by political systems, to the extent that by some people, concerns have been raised very loudly that our complete social fabric, including the political systems, might be not resilient enough and might actually be either heavily harmed or even destroyed in the not too far away future, or even in the present. But very interesting also is another interdependence we have discussed slightly before we started also with this meeting, and that is the interdependence of local and global. Now again, environmental, social, and also then the political structures, as we try to create a response through the political structures we have on a local level, also to what is going on globally. Unfortunately, here also, not always to the advantage of what we would like to see, this pathway towards an eco-civilization, because for the past, at least, reasoning of our societies, we have decided on a global level that we are not a common human endeavor, but more we are in a competition between regions, states, or then supranations. And this goes directly even to the local level. When on the local level, this is where I work at the moment most. For instance, if you try to develop new kinds of governmental also structures for only city development, you will find the same patterns of, I would call disturbing, but only from my point of view, okay, not for everyone, competitiveness, for instance, that cities within one country would decide that they want to be the city first of what you can now name it, even the most beautiful things like city first in knowledge creation, city first in innovation, city first in greening and in circularity. But what does this mean? Like, should there be a second? Should there be a third? And is it okay that we act in a way so that becoming the first, the second is already within our equation? And this is something that puzzles me in my direct work every day. But there is also confidence, confidence in politics. At least I'm so fortunate to live where I live now, Austria, in the midst of Europe. We may be, let's say, unsatisfied and sometimes angry about our politicians, our political systems, but we have the fortune to actually live in one of these 6% democracy, to live in a framework that is being negotiated within this political system and is being constructed into a legal framework, which is very important for the functioning and also the stability of a society. And also the being not sustainable but thrivable, because then you are in a at least negotiated safe space. So this is where I personally also like to distinguish between the questions of governance and politics, and then government. So for instance, when it comes to government and governance, although I have been involved also in some work with the Observatory for Public Service Innovation, which is government and governance. Innovation is meanwhile also at this level a key factor and taken very seriously, very responsible, but still there we need to balance out something like stability, and the other one is agility, and the agility comes with innovation, of course, but it's just, if I would imagine, like me now, this is now more my opinion than scientific fact, if I would imagine all my governmental structures would be constantly agile, would be constantly innovating, would there be any stability for me and then whatever we work in to actually find our meaningful collaborations within a society? Or would it be too agile? Then there's only one third fact. And the third fact, that when it comes to politics, something I have learned personal is that if we imagine that people who are in politics are mainly acting upon, let's say, an ideology or anything that you would call a common purpose, partly, but also they are acting on very particular or individual interests, and this has to be taken into account into the system dynamics as well. So what we see on the forefront might not be what is happening at the background. Of course, if you take these hopefully 3 levels, which I tried to articulate, into account, you can A, see the situation as is, and then B, also create the right circumstances or conditions around this, so that there is the opportunity of, let's say, some behavioral change.
Stefan, this is a perfect moment to bring Alexander on board and see. Alexander, Stefan very clearly introduced these 3 levels, and from 3 different sort of points of view or views on political system. So what can we learn, or how can we, what is the, which part of the science in system science can actually help us to manage this complexity in a more sort of sustainable manner, in a sense that is working for the benefit of a broader audience, that is not this individual drive that Stefan mentioned at the end, prevailing in the overall political landscape. What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and ideas with you, and to co-create. I think later we'll be getting into this conversation where we really are in this co-creative engagement. And in fact, we are then modeling the type of engagement and human beingness together, the interbeing, that I think we're looking for in the world. We'll see, but this, I think, is part of the answer is here. How are we interacting here among ourselves? So I just want to say again, thank you, and thank you particularly, Stefan, for opening the conversation with such excellent framing and key points. So I'm also looking forward to listening here. We have Emma and Indra and Elke and 𝗣cie, who have fantastic things to share with us. We'll be moving to that in just a moment. But let me pick up on a few of the things that both Violetta and Stefan touched upon. One is to understand that the nature of complex adaptive systems, such as human geopolitical dynamics, that is definitely a complex adaptive system, one of the most complex, because you're dealing with biological systems interacting with value systems in culture and in society, questions of identity, there's emotion, there's a huge amount of complexity in this. So when we're dealing with this in a period during which there is great pressures externally as well, so we're looking systemically and say, what are the pressures on humanity now? There are pressures coming externally that we can identify. Some of the pressures are not new. We've been living with them, but reacting very slowly. Things such as climate change. When we're in a framework of such interdependence as a species on a planet, and there is no more new frontier that we can expand into and just say, well, we can let this part of the world, you know, it doesn't matter, slash and burn, you know, those kind of cultures where we can just leave that alone because there's a new frontier where we can go to and develop there. Now, there's a level of true interdependence on our planet. And we're starting to see the limits of this. And this is what the whole movement of sustainability is about, of course. So we can no longer just do whatever we wish on this planet and say, oh, it's okay. Now we're starting to realize there are parameters. So this is one external factor. One that is very pressuresome and just very recent is, of course, the global pandemic. Another aspect that has brought us into the realization of our fundamental fragility and the fact that we cannot act simply based on our self-interest. Oh, I don't want to wear a mask. I do want to wear a mask. Oh, I want to. It's about the collective health. And that is something that we're starting to need to address now. And it's still very slow in the uptake for people to realize that this is not just whatever I feel is right, but what we must be doing for our collective best interest. It's a shift in perspective in that sense. So these are external parameters. Internal parameters come from the political systems themselves. There are degrees that we have seen with kind of more, shall we say, extremist governance systems where might equals right. There's a whole framing around what is called brutalism in politics. And the brutalist framework is saying that, first of all, we have colonized, these are usually the colonizing countries, we have colonized, and therefore this is the name of the game. If we can take over and we can make it our own, then that is simply part of the process, and we will continue to do so. That's a kind of colonial framework and mindset that is still active in much of politics today. There's a second level which has to do with privilege, and is very related to the first level, but the idea that, well, we have been here first, or we came and colonized. Maybe we haven't been here first, but we came and colonized, and we are now the ones who are in charge, and we're going to stay in charge. And there's a privilege notion to that component. And then there is a third notion, which is brutalism, which fits into this, which is the idea that might equals right. If I can prove my superiority by force, then I am the strongest, and being the strongest, I should be the leader. So there's that kind of framing that is now being summarized in this concept of brutalism in politics. And we see that in the recently departed regime in the United States. We see it actively in Brazil. We see it in a variety of different places around the world where, interestingly enough, this kind of extremist, I would call it extremist, but unbalanced engagement is still prevalent. What happens when you have these internal pressures in politics? These external pressures from the environment impinging on the system? We have what Violetta referred to earlier as a VUCA situation, where the situation is volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. So these frameworks, where some things are, where your situation is not something that you can understand well, given even the signals of change in the dynamics of the system, how does one respond to that? So I think this is the question that Stefan was also starting to get to when we looked at agility and stability and so on. So some of the things that I would like to address with this from a systems perspective is the frameworks that we can bring to this. One is Donella Meadows talks about systemic leverage points. What does that mean? Systemic leverage points are the places where you can intervene in a system that can most likely encourage certain types of change in certain directions. Doesn't mean dictating the outcome, but it means finding those sensitive points, again, looking for the leverage points to shift the discourse, to shift the engagement, to shift maybe the focus or the value discourse. And this is where we're starting to look at things like donut economics. We're starting to look at things that have to do with rewilding. We're starting to look at things that have to do more with self-empowered local governance engagements as well. And then connecting those local governance engagements into ecosystems of interrelated initiatives. I want to get back to that, but this idea of looking at the systemic leverage points is about finding the attractors to shift the discourse. The attractors, but this means finding again what is relevant, because as Victor Hugo once said, nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come. But that means that if you have a great idea, but it's not matching the listening of the public discourse at the time, it won't go anywhere. So finding ways to listen into, to find matches between the ideas for change and then the receptivity of people who need or wish or desire for that kind of change. And Violetta was mentioning that there's a real need for this kind of a thirst for this all around the world. Then finding that match and speaking that language, right? Addressing those value interests. So that's the systemic leverage points. But the other is the systemic nurturance spaces. The systemic nurturance spaces are the contexts. You can think of it like, in a good sense, the greenhouses. I don't mean it in terms of climate change, but I mean something that cultivates and creates a safe space for self-directed sustainable development, for discourse and engagement among people who wish to be able to engage in the design, in the interactive design of their own futures, right? How do you create those systemic nurturance spaces, welcome certain types of discourse, and create those frames? So a couple of things I want to mention. Well, let me do a few things before I get to some movements that are starting to happen, which I think are fantastic, very interesting. But Stefan talked about the shift also from kind of national identity to this city. You know, people will say, so where are you from? And often they will refer to, I'm from this city or that city, rather than I'm from this country. And this is an interesting shift to urban identity. And it actually holds promise for a kind of a re-engagement with an indigenous sense of the indigenous, a sense of this is where I'm from, this local area. And there is definitely the shift. Marilyn Hamilton and others have been exploring this notion of the city as the new locus of politics and of governance in that sense, and of economics and of international relations. It wouldn't be international relations, it would be interurban relations, I suppose. But that would be the framing that seems to be actually naturally emerging these times. What does that mean? I agree with Stefan. This is an interesting kind of emergence that we're seeing. Two more things, and then I'll bring this to a close. One is relating this idea of governance. You know, governance is needed. We're not, politics is another matter, but governance is, we definitely need this. In all complex adaptive systems, you have something called an EGS, an evolutionary guidance system. The evolutionary guidance system, the EGS, is which allows the systems to navigate their social and physical reality, right? It allows, like with the brain in the human being is a kind of EGS. We use it to navigate our social and physical reality. And you can think of this also at larger levels collectively. What is the evolutionary guidance system that allows inclusive fitness, if you want to look at it in Darwinian terms, although I prefer not to, because the idea is to actually think of it not just in terms of fitness and competition, but to think of it in terms of collective emergence, in ones that allow for not just sustainability, but thrivability. And this is where I want to go with the last few things here, Violetta, if you permit me just a few more moments. We talked about from stability to agility, very important. But I think there's something else emerging now that people refer to as anti-fragility. Anti-fragility. And what is anti-fragility? It's beyond agility. So when you're agile, you're able to adapt to change very rapidly as it arises. So in the same moment that some change happens, you're right away flowing with it and finding ways to move with it and adapt to it. But that's different from anti-fragility. In the frameworks of anti-fragility, there's a thriving on chaos. There's a thriving on uncertainty. There's a sense of, oh, look, we don't have a stable system, excellent. This gives us opportunity to be creative, to grow, to move, right? Obviously, it doesn't mean that you're looking for maximum chaos. There's a certain amount of thriving, as they call it, thriving at the edge of chaos, right? Where there's a certain amount of small change. 𝗣cie has led a lot of work in this with chaos pilots and other things that have to do exactly with navigating through complex terrains of uncertainty and dynamics of change. So I'm sure we'll hear from him on that in a moment. The last two things I want to mention here are movements that are emerging that I'm finding very interesting. One is called cosmolocalism. Cosmolocalism is emerging as a point of reference in international relations that, again, exactly moves beyond the national concept of relations and starts to look at how do we feel that we are manifesting our destiny, our engagement, our co-creative abilities where we live now, but in a way that is connected with global interests and global dynamics, taking into account questions of climate change, pandemics, other things that I mentioned earlier, external factors. So there's a sense of interdependence with a larger system, and yet locally grounded manifestation in our own identity and our own way of expressing that. That's this notion of cosmolocalism. Earlier, I think it was called glocalism, which is a horrible sounding word, right? But that's a global and local, globally informed, locally applied, locally relevant. That's kind of what now it's emerged into a more sophisticated concept of cosmolocalism. Fascinating. The other is something called liquid democracy. I don't know if you've heard of this concept of liquid democracy, but it's fascinating me because it is something that seems to me a real option for moving forward, what we would call a protopia. Neither a utopia, which is ideal but frustrating, nor a dystopia, which we don't want and just is a negative to avoid, and nor is it a myopia, which is just continuing what we're currently doing. A protopia is the feasible engagement with current realities for ongoing thrivability, right? That's the proto, what we can do now, not having to wait for some utopia future. And liquid democracy blends the notions of a truly participatory, interactive, democratic engagement, which we don't have yet because it's an ideal. In some places, for example, in the Quaker society, you can have governance by consensus, but it usually is in very small groups to be able to use this type of truly participatory, interactive engagement. But with the advent of the technologies that bring the different parts of the world together with such things as we're doing right now, there is a potential for actually having a greater participatory engagement. Right now we have representative democracy, and even that doesn't work very well. I mean, even if, yes, representative democracy is not ideal, but even if it were to work ideally, which it doesn't, we would need to have an evolution of that. So liquid democracy, what it does is it takes a kind of opportunistic frame that functions in terms of representative democracy when needed and when absolutely there's no other choice because of distance and dispersal, and you cannot get truly participatory dynamics, and when possible, functions in terms of participatory democracy. So there's a liquid frame between the representative and participatory. It flows back and forth as the opportunities arise. And Violetta, I see you want me to wrap up, and that was my last point there. I just wanted to say that's interesting for me how we are on that.
Alexander, thank you very much. This was excellent, and together with Stefan, you really created a really system framework within which we will have now a discussion with practitioners, those that live daily the challenges that you described, and I cannot wait but hear the reflections from them and some of the words that you used. I know they're very much familiar to them as well, and they're trying to explore and exercise them on a ground level. So please listen to them also carefully, and let's see what can emerge out of these both aspects by the end of today's session. So welcome now, 𝗣cie and Indra. 𝗘𝗍, as an active member of the Danish Parliament and globally known as a strong voice of democracy, and Indra, the pioneer of a grassroots democratic movements and optimist that actually we can, as citizens of the world, make a change. So I'm inviting you now to come in and contribute your thoughts. I think Alexander and Stefan were quite provocative in a way, because they already showed us some theoretical models ahead, and they seem or sound very attractive, and definitely we will continue to explore them even within the eco-civilization tribe. But let's hear 𝗘𝗍, you first. Thank you for being with us. And so how do you feel, how do you see the current political landscape? And would be great if you can connect a little bit to what it was said in the introductory remarks. 𝗘𝗍, please.
Yeah, first of all, I would start to say hi, Alexander. It has been a long time since we've been in contact, and actually I think the whole event here has only one purpose, that we should say hello to each other. So hello, Alexander. We met way back in San Francisco in the 90s and the zeros, and I hope your father is well. I don't know if he's still alive, but I hope he is well, and give him my greetings. So I'm sitting here in Copenhagen with my Corona hair. We have still lockdown, and I'm looking forward to my hairdresser will open up again in 2 weeks' time, and everything will be on track again. But democracy is not on track. And as you said, Violeta, the latest surveys we had from the think tank called Freedom House said that around 8% of the citizens of the world is living in a stable democracy. And out of the 196 nations which the world consists of, 80 nations have stepped down the democratic ladder during the last year. Only one nation has developed a stronger democratic system. The rest is status quo. So it says a bit about where we are right now. We see authoritarian regimes in Russia, in Turkey, in Brazil, in China, India, many places, and even in inside EU, European Union, we have some very serious setbacks in the Poland, Hungary, and other nation states in the EU. So that's where we are right now. And as you said, Violeta, my daily work is inside the system. It's inside the Danish Parliament. And I'm struggling on a daily basis on how to, on one hand, stand up for our democratic institutions, which is under pressure, and at the same time, reinvent them and make them more vital. And so for me, this discussion goes, I have to go on two legs in this discussion. One is how to protect what we have, and the other leg is how can we create the future we would like to live in. And I think that, and I know that Indra, I hope at least Indra will cover that part of it, is all the good stuff which is happening out there. I think my role right now is maybe to focus a bit about some of the really serious issues we're dealing with on inside the system as we know it today. And I have to actually sometimes to go back to some of the old guys who have said something about this. For example, 𝗍𝗍, who said that the old system is dying, but the new system has not been born yet. And this in between the monsters will show up. And that's where I am, Violeta. I try to push if I should try to describe 3 stages of democracy as which is familiar for me, is of course the representative democracy as we have in Scandinavia, and I want to push that to the next level, which I would call involved democracy. So how can we involve the citizens much more in the decision process? But on the long run, I would like to see a much more direct democracy. And maybe I'm just starting to get old, so remind myself about my anarchistic views. But I would really like to see the system turned 180 degrees around. So we have a democratic decision process from the bottom up. And I think some of the dilemmas we are facing right now, and I think it's really a dilemma, but also a huge paradox, is that as both Alexander and Stefan talked about this localism, that we see a lot of decisions are going down to the local city level, and a lot of decisions are going up to regional level, European, in this case, EU level. So the power base, the national state power base, has to get a new identity, so to speak, and figure out a new role. And I think that that's a paradox, that at the same time that a lot of political decisions are going down, and at the same time up, and there's a political vacuum in the middle, we see in nationalism showing its ugly face. And I think that's a huge political, interesting paradox and dilemma, how to deal with that. So that's where I am, Violetta. I think you should ask me some questions if you want to get me to elaborate further.
No, that's great, 𝗘𝗿. I mean, this is exactly the introduction to your discussion with Indra that we needed, because now I'm asking Indra to come in and give us the bottom-up perspective. So where are we citizens in all this? 𝗘𝗿 said that, you know, there are processes coming top-down and bottom-up, and there is vacuum in the middle. But what about us, citizens? How do we actually feel? What do you see right there on the ground? Please, Indra.
Hi there, and very happy to be here. And I should have just explained just historically a little bit that I started the platform, The Alternative UK, at 4.5 years ago. And in fact, we're the sister platform of The Alternative that 𝗘𝗿 started in Denmark. And in many ways, 𝗘𝗿 is a mentor of mine. And I've been very inspired over the years by the essential things that 𝗘𝗿 has brought to the political scene. But when we decided to start something in the UK, it was very obvious that we couldn't start a political party, because our system in the UK prevents any small political party from making any impact whatsoever. We have what we call a first past the post system. And you've seen the fate, for example, of the Green Party, you know, with 5 million members and one member of parliament. It just didn't seem sensible for us to waste our lives in that way. So we started to look from a different perspective. And then when we started to look from a different perspective, we actually saw a whole new world of reality and experience around these two questions of where is the power and where is our agency? So you should remember that at this time we were going through the Brexit period, and it was also very recently that Trump had been elected. And the reality for people is that it's the most people, if you like, that are being harnessed by the elites to think and act in certain ways. Our own agency, our own power doesn't have any expression in the public space. So when you look at the facts across Europe, and certainly in the UK, but actually across Europe, only 2% of people are members of political parties. Now, if you think about that, that's quite extraordinary. Some people would say, oh, it's, you know, it's just not in the it's not to the taste of people to be involved in politics, but it's much more than that. You know, only 2% of people think it's worth their time and their money to be invested in this current political system. At the same time, this current political system, the 2%, really create the entire political discourse that our media feeds on. So we're looking at a political discourse and a story around power that is really being experienced by everyone. And implied in that story is the people are powerless. The people have little to say. The people need to be told what to do. The people, you know, are the objects, not the subjects of our democracy. So once you decide, and we made a conscious decision to step out of that 2% into the 98% and start to look at where does the power lie actually amongst people, and how does this crisis appear? Now, when you start to look from that perspective, even, and I recommend it, don't read the newspapers for a bit and try to see it from another perspective. What you discover is that people have been themselves going through what can only amount to a revolution for the last 20 years. So over this past 20 years, since the birth of the internet, there has been a massive change in people's experience of the public space. Not only have they been massively connecting with each other, they have been able to mobilize themselves, organize themselves in completely different ways, but also they've been able to experience themselves personally in the public space. So, you know, if you join Facebook, you're not just meeting friends and having discussions. You're not talking about the mainstream political issues. You're talking about yourselves. You're talking about each other. You're watching yourself perform in the public space. So your own experience of your power and your agency is changing and has been changing rapidly over this past 20 years. So the people, in fact, have had a very, you know, actively developing sense of themselves for quite some time now. Now, think about that in relationship to things like the waking up of people. Now, how have we witnessed the waking upness of people who have access to each other and to information they never had before over this past 20 years? Well, we've seen that in a number of ways. We've partly seen it in, you know, for the same amount of time, you know, public uprisings. So anything from Occupy to the Arab Spring, you know, to what happened in Barcelona, to, I mean, all sorts of uprisings of people who are wanting to express their own power and agency more. But it's also in a much more subtle ways, people self-organizing at community level and deciding to take on the narrative or take on the story that they're telling about themselves and wanting to share a new story. So this ability or this sense that they can take over the public space as what Joseph Nye would call non-state actors is not only a fantasy, it's also a reality. So people have been, you know, for example, to take a very difficult, you know, example, how ISIS was able to tell a huge story about power and, in fact, have a direct impact on foreign policy budgets. This was simply the ability to use soft power in the public space, tell a new story through spectacle, the use of videos, the use of, you know, the use of violence, but mostly understanding the impact on people's emotions. So this is now become a massively emotional space in which who can, in a way, play the emotions best can win. Now, for some people, and there was a recent documentary that I think a lot of people saw called The Social Dilemma. For some people, this has been blamed on Facebook and Google and Twitter and so on. But if you're a student of this, as I'm sure many of us are in this room, you'll know that this has been going on for all of our lives. That we've all been subject to advertising, to propaganda, to manipulation of our minds, all of our lives. Why else are we in the mess we're in? Why else have we become mindless consumers of endless, you know, material goods? We're simply the fodder and the machine of the growth economy that has destroyed our planet. How did we get into that position, right? So all of this, people are slowly waking up to. Well, in fact, not even slowly. We've seen, even in last year, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, no end of hashtag movements that show people waking up to something. Now, what is the possibility of that? The internet is in fact a place of possible chaos. It's not a regulated space, and worse than that, it is being softly controlled by the people who own the software. So we do, in fact, have a form of global governance right now. We could call that Facebook, right? We could call it Google. These are all soft forms of global governance. However, the people don't own it. They are simply the product of it. Their data is manipulated. So where I see the most promising changes now are, yes, at the local level, people coming together, in places like cities, for example, or in towns as well. It's not simply cities, meeting each other, building relationships, creating trust, but being in, as Alexander was saying, this cosmo-local reality which the internet offers. And what they're building is small systems at the local level. So these are not flat, small, irrelevant, I resist bottom up. They are fractal organizations that are beginning to connect with each other globally. And it has a lot of potential. Now, I don't know if anybody's aware of the 3 horizons model, which says, there's a first level, there's a second level, there's a third level. The first is really what is, the third is what we all dream of. And what 𝗘𝗿𝗏 was pointing at was this very fragile second level. If we don't consciously shift our attention and our energies to the thing that we choose to happen in the future, then even this very promising cosmo-local, people coming together, new agency and power will collapse because it's under so much strain, it cannot really become buoyant. And the only thing I would say finally, in response to something that Alexander said, but also 𝗘𝗏 pointed at, is that from this cosmo-local level, liquid democracy is not the answer. Going directly as individuals into a technological process will only replicate what we have already. Things can easily be polarized. People coming as themselves with opinions is not the answer. What is different at the local level or the cosmo-local level and in communities is that people are moving into relationship with each other, they consider things, and they change their minds. So this is a very important aspect of the people's voice. It's not billions of single voices. It's people moving into self-organization, deliberating events, and coming to considered outcomes. And self-governance is a very important part of the new era of global governance. I think I've said a lot, and that's probably enough.
Indra,
I'm hopeful.
May I jump in here after this really deep and deeply provocative statements that you made? But as 𝗘𝗏 pointed out previously, there is some sort of vacuum now in, we know that the old world is not working, but we don't want to destroy it before we have a new one that is built that we can actually move into. But what you were describing, can you see some transitional sort of path towards new structures as well? You mentioned a little bit that these fractal cells are now connecting, but this, at least from my experience when I worked a lot in the grassroots as well, is that at one point they disappear again. It's in that sense, it's very liquid. So they come together, they disappear. They are not really fixed because there is no top-down structure within which they would actually coexist. So how do you see that? Would that even be possible with the concept of this constant reemergence? Have you seen or tested anything like that?
Yes.
That maybe come in and fill in the vacuum that Uwe was talking about?
Yes, and in fact, I'm going to come back to my very first point that I made about my relationship with 𝗣𝗏, if you don't mind me saying 𝗣𝗏. But I feel that there's a partnership there. So because you're working at the parliament level in the system, the political system, that is the dominant political system. And we in the UK are working from this human-centered cosmolocal position. For me, that has the promise of what I would call a parallel system. So Václav Havel pointed at this parallel system, but he talked about it more as politics and artists. But I think it's valid. You know, what I see is the importance of people coming together, experiencing relationship and trust, but they need to hold on to their power and their agency. If even at the local level, they give that away to the local council, it changes the nature of their agency almost immediately. So this phenomenon of what we call citizens' action networks or community agency networks are appearing all over the world. So you might say transition towns, you might say eco-villages, you might say mutual aid networks that have sprung up in their millions around the world as a result of COVID. It's simply people coming together across all divides to find solutions to the problems that they're working in the cosmolocal way. However, there's still the work to be done at the national level and international level that, as 𝗣𝗏 describes, protects the stability of the world as we know it, which has reached a certain point of stability and doesn't want to go backwards. So there needs to be a partnership, even at the grassroots level, with the state and with the governance systems that exist now that are also trying to improve themselves. So like two systems that are constantly evolving but need to be in partnership. And in the UK, and it's in Holland as well, in Portugal as well, different parts of the world, but let's describe in the UK. We have this partnership identified in a movement called flat pack democracy, where a citizen-led community elected members of their own community to go and stand to take over the council, and they stood for the council as independents. So they weren't allowing, in a sense, the old party political system to define the usual divisions. They called themselves independents, and they were there to honor and hold the participation of all the citizens. So now you had people who believed in participation in both parts of the parallel system that we're trying to give birth to. So both parts now honoring the desire to give people participation. Now, if you think about that working itself up through municipalism and then through regional levels, our sense is that there needs to be a people's parliament that exists alongside the House of Commons that we now have, and that these should be in partnership and holding these two very different ideas of what the future holds, you know, holding them at the same time. So it's not simply to do with the development of politics as we know it, it's to release something and say something else is developing at the same time. And I would call this socio-politics. I don't call it politics anymore, but I call it socio-politics. And it has this parallel system. That's just an experiment that's going on in the UK.
This is perfect moment and to bring 𝗣𝗏 back. 𝗣𝗏, you pointed out this vacuum in the middle. Can you relate to what Indra was saying in the sense that of this parallel system to be built and then reconnected with some existing structures? But I remember your concern that you raised in our previous talks about a challenge that maybe some destructive forces in our societies will not be patient enough to wait for this transition to take place. How do you see it? I mean, can you see that this could be done in a sort of transitional, engaging, collaborative manner? Will that potentially create some conflicts? Or do you see anything new emerging in that field?
Yeah, I totally follow what Andra is saying, also because that's how we are working inside the parliament at the moment. And even if I have left the Alternative Party and now are starting a new political party called Independent Greens, of course, it's most on the long way the same kind of values and perspectives, etc. And we have suggested in the parliament exactly what Andra are talking about, that up till 1953 we had a two-chamber system in Denmark, as they have in UK with the House of Lords and the House of Commons. In 53 we closed down the House of Lords and had only House of Commons, and now we have suggested that we re-establish a two-chamber system, where the new chamber would be the Citizens' Assembly, and it should be an ongoing city assembly structure and institution, where we select up to 100 citizens, which mirror the diversity in society on all the parameters you can imagine. And that's actually also an interesting issue, that the most parliaments today consist of people who look alike, cross-party lines. They have the same kind of education, they have the same social networks, cultural perspectives, etc. Even if they are right-wing or left-wing, they come from the same universities and had climbed up through the same kind of power structure inside the parties. So the parliament today does not reflect the diversity of the society. There's not as many colored faces in the Danish parliament as there are on the street. There's not equal women and men, etc., etc. So to establish a citizens' assembly, an ongoing citizens' assembly inside the parliament, that's one way to go. And that's one of the tools we have in the toolbox to reinvent democracy. And I think that, at least for me, it has been interesting to really take in that we haven't arrived to the destiny when it comes to how experienced we can imagine democracy, even if we are so self-good in Scandinavia and thinks we are on the top of the world also when it comes to democracy. But this is just one phase, and we have to go to the next level. And I think that this, to create a bridge between the old and the new, is the way forward. And that was also where I started in my small speeches, this dilemma that today I have to stand up for the established structures at the same time as I have to invent them. So that's how I see it.
But Uwe, let me challenge you a little bit also on the situation in the EU. We all know that EU is over and over again reinventing itself. But as we noticed in the last 5, 6, 7 years, the extremism is rising, and it's actually challenging all the processes that want change being too slow or inappropriate, and constantly putting a pressure on democracy to prove itself that can deliver results in a challenging situation. So how do you, what's your point on that?
But again, I think that it's a complex question you raise here, because there are so many levels, and we can't cover it all. But I think that one of the reasons why we have a bumpy road in the EU, the European Union, is that the contract from the first phase was not clear enough. So there are some internal structures that doesn't work. I will give you an example. Next week, I have to be on the floor in the Danish Parliament to discuss the LGBT-free zones in Poland. And it's on the agenda. How should Denmark respond to what is happening in Poland at the moment? And we want actually the people who have suggested this discussion and this agenda would like to see that Denmark will take Poland to the European Court to figure out how to have a reaction. And I think many of us in the EU, at least among my friends, are so frustrated that you can see what is happening in Orban's Hungary or in Poland, and EU don't have the tools to say, okay, if you are not living up to our value standards and rules of law or human rights issues, then you either can't be a member of the European Union or you can't get economic support, etc. So I think there's a tension inside the European Union among many people that if you want to be a member, then you have to invest in the common good. And if you don't live up to the standards, there is a reaction and a consequence. And I think it's a structural issue that the contract was not clear from the start. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that at least, and this is very internal Danish issue, but when we were became member of the European Union, we were sold an economic project. It was about selling pigs. If you could get a good price for your pig, then that was nice. EU was nice because we could sell a hell of a lot of pigs and bacon. But the European Union, for other people, I think that for the founding fathers, was a political project. It was a value project. It was a peace project. Of course, also economic project. But for many new member states of the European Union, it has been, this is good for business. And so there's something about the contract which has not been clear. And there's something about that the structure which was built up didn't have the power to actually to be effective and have consequence if people were playing outside the rule. Yeah, that's my quick reflection.
Indra, may I get back to you, because when I was listening to you, it sounded that maybe these grassroots movements that are moving up the scale could potentially provide a solution for this kind of situation. What do you think?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because what I'm hearing from 𝗣cie is actually it's a mindset, you know, that was the mindset, in fact, in which we designed a lot of our political institutions. You know, there's a transactional, material mindset, you know, which looks at the human being as Homo economicus, if you like. That's what the human being is. You know, it needs tax cuts, and it needs money, and it needs a roof over its head. That's basically the human being. You know, people are always quoting Maslow's hierarchy as a sort of justification for that, you know, as if the only thing that politics is really responsible for is giving you enough money to just survive. And then after that, it's up to you. But we know that's a lie. You know, that isn't how human beings thrive. In fact, human beings have many emotional and psychological and spiritual needs to be able to thrive. And unless you conceive of power, knowing all of that, then you're just going to keep running into trouble. And that's what we've done. You know, we've built a whole global economy on on an idea that we are that a machine that can create an outcome which is which is the growth economy, and that will just keep building buildings with the proceeds of that. And look what's happened. We've destroyed our nature. There is no way. The discourse does not exist there within the power structure, because the elites have built their power on this material notion of what their leadership is for. And we've all had to buy into it because we had no choice. At the ground level, this is exactly what's shifting, right? So in communities, when people who have been really divided start to move into conversation with each other on principle of, we need to get to know each other because we're so divided, it's caused violence in our cities and in our towns and even in our families. The main thing is to get over this division. Once these dialogues begin, so much more is on the table than simply economics. People are talking about relationship, their needs, who they are being, their identities, their experience of life. I mean, that's what's going on. That's what's waking up in people, this wholeness of their lives. And they want to build new systems based on that. And I think to some extent we can thank Mark Zuckerberg and we can thank Instagram that they've actually nurtured this conversation hugely, right? And so people's got a new sense of themselves. And if they were doing those negotiations that 𝗘𝗿𝗁 just describing, they wouldn't be going about them in the same way. They wouldn't be talking about the people at arm's length as if the people do this or the people do that. No, they would be inquiring from the people how this lands with them, what matters to them. The problem with looking at countries from a great height and describing the people is that generally you're just talking about the past and how people were manipulated and made to be understood to themselves. The truth isn't really there. So, to take it back to the relationships being built and the new awareness of what it means to be a citizen and the power that can arise from that to me is a great possibility for the future, especially with the young people moving straight into that space and being very capable of doing that, much more so than, let's say, our generation. I don't know who I'm including here and who I'm not. I'll let you exclude or include yourself. It's a new conversation. And mostly I'm listening and supporting and activating and trying not to load too many of the old problems on the young people.
Excellent, thank you. I saw a little message from Alexander that he would like to come in and add a bit of spice to this, because there was one point of disagreement, and disagreement always brings a new understanding. So Alexander, please go ahead.
Okay, I will. Thank you so much. I also am really looking forward to hear from 𝗘𝗶𝗁 and Emma as well. So I'll try not to take too much time here. It's interesting because on the one hand, I very much agree with Indra, with what you're saying with regard to the need for kind of shifting the frame. Yes, we talk about cosmolocalism, but truly we need to talk about a relocalism, a sense of bringing self-determination into the hands of the communities that are engaging in their own decision-making about their own futures. And I fully agree with that aspect. In fact, as 𝗘𝗿𝗁 will know, and Heather Tischbauern, who's here as well, and Bert will know, I've been working on the notion of evolutionary learning communities, communities that learn how to learn in harmony with the dynamics of their broader environment. And then you can create communities of those communities and create an evolutionary learning ecosystem. And this truly, I think, is where the power resides. So there's not spice there yet, Violetta, because that's where we agree. But what I disagree with is that the quest for the ideal of participatory democracy that 𝗘𝗿𝗁 was talking about, that vision, I think, is inspirational and I think is good as a guiding vision. Indeed, we see it in some communities that are bringing into play the dynamics of Ubuntu. There was a whole focus in our eco-civilization conversations on Ubuntu and interbeing, where we have a collective sense of being that arises from our not the sum of our individual interactions, but truly our collective sense of identity. Very powerful. And this at the level of the local, but to understand, again, systemically, the level of interdependence of our global world, I think that we have to do a both and engagement. It's not either localism and not participatory, or even for me, liquid democracy is interesting because it's like you have a slider. You can move, you can say, okay, so in this community, we can use very much participatory. In this community, we slide it more towards representative. Here it's more direct democracy. Here is a movement, right? It's not a fixed. And that's what's intriguing for me, because, and I will wrap up here, Violeta, sorry. I'm taking an I don't want to get into the economics aspect of this, but I just want to take an analogy with economics, because you have macroeconomics and microeconomics, and they are very different in their focus and in the way they engage, right? They make macroeconomic frameworks and microeconomic frameworks. In the same way, I think we have macropolitics and micropolitics. Okay? Or macro governance is a better way to come up with Stefan's kind of distinction. It's more about macro governance and micro governance. At the macro level, I think efforts towards liquid democracy are important to engage with, are important to look at what are those frameworks that can encourage and house within them local self-determination. But this is about large-scale collective decision-making processes that are not only the result of the connection among the parts, which is what I mentioned before, the systemic leverage points, the upward causation, where we have the parts, the communities connecting to make the society. That's excellent. We also need to look at the downward causation or the systemic nurturance spaces and say, what are the macro frameworks in politics now for international, maybe take away the word national, but for large scale regional relations? That is still going to go on and needs to go on. So the question is, unless we're going to break down and say we're not going to be interacting globally. If we're not interacting globally, then everything becomes local. But if we're doing things globally, we need to have both a focus on the dynamics of our macro interactions, which are not just community to community. They're actually aggregate to aggregate. That, for me, it can be best served by liquid democracy, whereas something like the focus on these evolutionary learning communities and putting them into evolution learning ecosystems is much more served by a direct localism, kind of cosmo-localism.
Okay, can I be here provocative a little bit? And Indra, I'd like you to respond then. Is when I was listening to you, Alexander, I was picturing European Union. And currently, that's exactly what we have. We have a liquid democracy. Yeah, because each member state understands the rule of law in its own way. Each member state understands the freedom of speech on its own way. So, but somehow that is creating and escalating conflicts rather than bringing some sort of coexistence and collaboration closer. So.
Can I just make clear, Violeta?
But I'm not saying.
Just make clear. That's not liquid democracy. I just want to make clear that that is not liquid democracy. That's a collection of different democratic styles, but it doesn't form a unitary system. Liquid democracy has, if this is an aggregate of individual democracies, that's not the same as a liquid.
Yeah, but you said that one community can have stress on something else than the other one. So there's somehow there is no coherent understanding of maybe fundamentals on which one can build trust and collaborate. But I will ask you to explain this further, because it might be the most challenging actually issue. But let me see what Indra thinks about it, how she understood you, and maybe respond also to this challenge. Can we have lots of diversity in a sense of fundamental elements that are part of the democratic structures. Please, Indra.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think this is the subject for the next, 2 hours, because what you're pointing at, Alexander, I can't disagree that it's not simple. I agree, it's not simple. However, I'm not sure I would make the same clear distinction between micro and macro that you're making, because once upon a time, everything was in its place, and that's no longer the case. Now the micro, is the fractal, and the fractal, has a very great influence and can shape the public space and has an effect. So where is the macro now? It's quite difficult to know. So I think this simple, and it's always shifting, right? So I think you're also aware of like the integral perspective on development. The way that I would look at that is that in any room of people, including this one, there are many different kinds of agency trying to be expressed at one time. How do we work with the many different kinds of agency? You can't simply compare one country to another. Maybe we should start limiting the size of a country to 5 million in the way that Scotland would like to do. There are so many factors in knowing where does power lie and how can we look forward to taking part in that new system, many. But one thing I think we've decided to do, which may be what 𝗣elle is asking, is we've decided to build something that we feel can help us get to a result by 2030, because we have a window within which we have to make a difference, right? And that for us is this. It's the climate window, which we're probably all aware of, whether you buy into it or not. It's a very dominant narrative now. And we would like to see citizens coming together in citizens' action networks, meeting other citizen action networks globally, coming to consensus between us about best practice, about new methods, about using technology well, about creating a commons. We would have a list, like a manifesto of our ideal ways, or the ways that we feel is possible to change the direction our planet is going. That's something we just are on board with now, because we feel it's possible, because the internet and the technology would allow it to be so. And then let's see what happens. Our sense is if we only wait to see what happens next and everything's emergent and we don't know, then we're really giving ourselves away to the people who've already decided we're more or less going to stay on course. There's some sort of solutionism idea, but it's going to destroy the skies. Who cares? They've got their bunkers. I mean, you've got to make a choice somewhere. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not saying politics is broken, what's the alternative? Question mark, question mark, question mark. We're now saying, after 4 years, politics is broken, here's the alternative. That's what we're trying to build now.
Super, thank you, Indra. Alexander, would you like to come back with a very short reply, because we do have to move on, and I see that Stefan would like to contribute something too. Please, Alexander.
Very short, just saying I fully agree with what Indra is saying, except I don't believe there is an alternative. I think we need to we're not looking for the alternative. We're looking for a multi-pronged approach, mainly focused on citizen action networks of the sort that she's describing. I agree, but also focused on this, the questions of the global interactive frameworks. I think both are needed. And to say we only need citizen action networks, I would take issue with that.
No, we need both.
Okay, then we're good.
Super. Thank you. Okay, very good. That was excellent discussion. Stefan, please come in, and then I need to move on to Emma and Elke.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it fits now, but during listening to you very deeply, I was reminded of some of the work I've been engaged with on very regional level, like not even cities, but towns and rural development. Sorry, villages and rural development, that's what I wanted to say. And I found it very puzzling because, of course, totally agree with, you know, this citizen engagement and participative processes, and we set that up, and it worked very well. But there was one thing that, at least at that time, now it wouldn't be surprised anymore, but at that time was surprising for me, that it's not only what was in my mindset also, that there would be elites having these power relations, or having these also different value systems, but really everyone within these village councils, like they were really everyone there. They expressed their values and their identities in such a diverse and sometimes contradictory way, that the idea of, well, let's just come all together and then we have a consensus, might be not the case. But then also working with the, what is it called, the contradictions, and really at the point of contradiction where you think two people can't actually get along anymore because of how they perceive the world and what is important to them, not only on a materialistic point of view, by the way. That can be really deep into psychological or spiritual belief systems and such. But working on these frictional points, that is the most fruitful, actually. But it takes quite a good setup also for taking that into a community or in a, right. So this is the only thing I was reminded now, that it's not like, if people would come together without power structures, then they find a solution, like, oh, we're all humans here.
Yeah. That's why in parallel these participatory tools are being developed in order to manage, of course, these difficult situations and processes. But,
right.
This is something we need to learn, how to listen and how to respect the different opinions, but still find common denominators that are worth engaging over, and they contribute to a better society. So if you allow me at this point, I would like to move on. Indra and of course, 𝗘𝗿, you disappeared for a second, I mean, for a few minutes, but I'm glad you are back. I would ask you and Indra as well for a wrap-up sentences. But let me now go to Emma. Emma is a young European politician, a young lady who is very much engaged with the youth parliament and youth politics. So I'm very happy, Emma, that you are with us today, because we would really like to hear your opinion, and I would appreciate if you can unmute yourself, about how do you hear us, I mean, adults talking with all these experiences and projects, but how does that sound to you? I mean, is this something that it's appealing to the young generations? Is something that you are also thinking about and trying to engage in? Or is this like another planet? Please, Emma.
Yes, thank you so much for the word, and thank you so much for inviting me. I always say that the fact that we've come together to the table and inviting young people already shows that there is, you know, such thing as inclusion in our society, and that we value each other and respect each other, which is always the first step forward. And I guess because we spoke a lot about democracy, and we especially ended with the tone politics is broken, so here's the alternative. I'll just start with pointing out that, you know, I was born in the time when 𝗘𝗿𝗁cie𝗰𝗶𝘃𝗶 wrote for Foreign Affairs the article, The Rise of Illiberal Democracy, where he said, you know, within the 21st century, there won't be a problem with democracy, there will be a problem within democracy. And that is what my generation is facing right now. And regarding now these democracies, not to say, not to speak of only one, but to speak of them as many, and to pick up on the point that only 2% of people are members of political parties, that doesn't mean that political participation with the youth doesn't exist. It just exists in various forms, which are not politically institutionalized. You know, political institutions that we've mentioned already are this kind of far approach, although they're trying to come closer to young people, but you know, in our society, and I grew up with ideals of democracy, and a lot of, I mean, most of my generation we believe in grassroots movements. And we see this always as the first step of becoming engaged. Youth engagement usually begins with, you know, being part of a civil society. We now also see innovative approaches such as setting up youth forums. Yet, all, you know, youth forums, they do prepare young leaders, but on the other hand, they're also quite exclusive at the moment. So, you know, they only choose the best of the best, and only those who have the most experience, and so on and so forth. But, you know, it's definitely a step forward, but obviously we're not there yet. And I think most important is to highlight the protest movements. And we've seen that with Future for Fridays, where, you know, I think she was 14 or 15 at the time, Greta Thunberg, she started a global movement, which means, you know, it's not even about having to have a worldwide network. You don't need to be a politician to do something, to create a change, but it can just be one small girl protesting. But of course, she wouldn't have been picked up had it not been for social media. And this is where, you know, everything ends. I mean, begins and ends with the post-millennial generations. It's hard to keep up with everything that's being done on social media, and digital literacy is becoming very important. And democracy or democracies are now on social media. If we look at, for instance, what has happened on Twitter with Trump being banned, you know, this Western political correctness, which is now brought forth with social media corporations telling us what we can and cannot read, means that, you know, we've come to a point where my generation is based on quick fixes. And quick fixes are not enough because they're just hiding prejudice, and it does not match institutional change because it's ineffective, and it disproportionates punishment because it does nothing but create resentment and fear. And it creates new platforms where they can speak, you know? So I think that it's on the one hand, it's very worrisome because what used to be a very formal sort of engagement, and I think if I remember correctly, Indra spoke about this, how with this cosmolocalism, the next step is people coming together. But what we've seen now is they do come together, it's just via internet and it's via social media. There's trust is established online, sadly. And I'll just take, for example, Instagram. A couple of days ago, I know that the BBC and The Guardian wrote how Instagram has become a hub for young neo-Nazis to recruit young people from far-right movement groups. And now this, you know, Instagram is based on finding people with similar values as your own. It creates recommendations, and it just focuses on visual media to create and it creates an ideal for spreading propaganda. And we don't talk about it enough. Because we always thought, I remember about a year ago, I was in Vienna at a conference, and I had, I listened to a lecture where the lecturer, he studied China and Austrian-Chinese relations, and he said, oh, TikTok is not a problem, it'll be gone within a month. But look at it now. We've even had troubles, you know, with the European court saying TikTok, I mean, how data is being sold and bought and so on and so forth. So I think this is definitely something important and which should be talked about way more, especially for the generation coming. And nonetheless, just to emphasize why, also because post-COVID-19 world will be when my generation will come to the employment market. And we know, we've seen from the 2008 crisis that youth unemployment rises majorly when a crisis happens, and we will have an economic crisis for the next 4 or 5 years. So this will definitely create new trends, and the question is now, how can we have a fruitful debate and continue having a fruitful debate with various actors, with not being in your own bubble, with not being on social media, which creates a bubble for you, but with listening to various voices, to being open to discussions, and to teach also younger generations to be critical thinkers who are also digitally very literate. So I will end with that. Thank you.
Great, Emma. Thank you very much for your point of view. I think with your very practical examples, you kind of touched many of the points of the discussion that we've had during this session. And I'm glad that I can sense that the young generation is with us in this ongoing search for a new ways of engagement, and new ways of coming together and making decisions together, and hopefully reinventing democracy to the point that it stays a very serious sort of option for the engagement of people and the politics overall. So thank you very much, Emma. So before I open the floor for questions, let me now go to 𝗘𝗏𝗃. 𝗘𝗏𝗃, please unmute yourself. 𝗘𝗏𝗃 is a long-standing politician, activist, person who is a voice of democracy, coming from Germany originally, and was also part of European Parliament. So I ask 𝗘𝗏𝗃 to listen carefully and sort of pick the cherries that could be some key messages that we can take forward, and even focus even more on them out of this discussion. But by no means this is the only, so there is no pressure on you, 𝗘𝗏𝗃, but I would like, with your strong background, political background, I'd like to hear what you've heard during this session. Please, 𝗘𝗏𝗃.
Yeah, thank you very much for everything. So I really heard a lot, and to be very honest, I am probably more full of new questions rather than answers, but maybe that's a good thing. So maybe one thing to what Stefan and Alexander said at the beginning, question, what I noticed is that you left out some elements, maybe also due to lack of time, that run politics and politicians, let's say global corporations, so that governments and maybe even the EU does not really have the room for maneuver that we think they ought to have. But from a systemic point of view, you didn't mention that. And I was wondering, and I was wondering whether you're more focused on what Violetta calls weak signals, so the new elements that you see arising, so that you could then follow, oh, let's see where we can put more energy into and then help it. So maybe that's why you left out a little bit of the analysis of what is actually blocking and really putting a break to current politics. And then we had the conversation between 𝗘𝗏𝗃 and Indra, and 𝗘𝗏𝗃 within a parliament, so within one of the traditional structures, and Indra picking up and using, let's say, 𝗘𝗏𝗃's very progressive approach to more participation and more involvement of citizens. Indra picking it up and using 𝗘𝗏𝗃 as her mentor. I like that very much. And 𝗘𝗏𝗃 was raising the question, now we have a broken system, but we haven't got anything new yet in place, nothing fully fledged new. So are the monsters coming in here? And 𝗘𝗏𝗃 also talked about the 3 levels that he was thinking of. And then Indra came in and talked about what she has already seen emerging and given her work to at the people's level. And I very much, I want to repeat that, I very much like the sentence, don't read the newspapers, even though it's maybe not fully focusing on this topic, but I found that very important. Now, I also see, maybe I can add that from my point of view, I see a lot of new structures emerging now in the crisis, and really professional structures. And it reflects a little bit that politicians, I feel that I've been feeling that for years, totally underestimate citizens. I mean, we have lawyers, we have really intellectual people, we have everyone, we have people who know whatever they do, bakers, whatever they do, they know what they are doing. And we are being infantilized, as one of my counterparts called it once. So what we see emerging here is something which is completely independent from the old structures. And that I say that towards 𝗣𝗏 now. Maybe we can also come to a new structure, and I saw that emerges, and so that the old can break away. And maybe we don't necessarily need, that's my thinking now, what you said, we need kind of a bridge or some cooperation between the old and the new. So I don't know whether we really need that, but that is me. What I very much support and loved is this, that we come together and consciously decide in this broken system, where do we want to go together? And then really use various practices at various levels. And Alexandra and Indra talked about the micro-political level and the macro-political level. And then see, what do these people want? What can they actually bring in? And when you talked about the macro-political level, I was thinking of the Swedish competition, which was done in 2017. It was run by the Global Challenges Foundation, and it was called A New Shape. And they called upon the people in the world, and anybody could take part. How would you like the more democratic world to look like? And I had even two friends here, one group and one individual here in Munich, where I'm based. They took part, and actually the individual person, he, out of 2,500 participants, he was one of the 24 best people, so he got invited to Sweden. And the assumption was, how do you want to make this world more democratic? You can either come up with the UN and some additions or renewal of the UN, or something completely new, or something which links to the UN. So there has been something in place, and it somehow got stopped. And I probably say that as a last thing. All these also, Emma, you also mentioned democratic movements, and you raised some of the challenges that you as the young people have, notably also regarding the future employment. Of course, that is a real challenge. And I bring that back to the current crisis situation that we have. With all the movements that you see, we left out the citizens' movement for democracy, that I see notably, Stefan, in your country, in Austria, and in our country here. That's what I'm watching closest at the moment. And this is so different to me than Occupy and everything, because they actually start creating something new, whereas Occupy Wall Street, they had some, they had their ideas, but they haven't started creating something new. So I think we ought to take them into our thinking. And the other thing is, all these ideas that you've come up with and all the elements, how far do you think they can be implemented at the moment, where we are in a situation without any civil rights? I mean, let's face it, we haven't got a lot of civil rights. Some of us are being told, depending on the country where you live, at what time you have to be at home, who you can meet at what time, and so on, and no travels. That's all fine. But does that give us enough room for maneuver to help all these grassroots organizations that you want to bring forward and bring together? And the last thing that I very much loved is the listening part. So, and I sum that up here. So the consciously deciding what we want, where we want to go, and the listening part. However, in how far is that currently, under the current situation, possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elke, as well. Thank you for your points of reflection and the importance of, especially the last message, the importance of listening. I think this was stressed over and over again by everyone, listening, engaging, and then collaboratively moving forward. So now I'm opening the floor for possible comments or questions. If anybody would like to come in, or maybe 𝗘𝗰𝘁𝗶𝗃𝗶, if there is not a comment, but a question from the comment line, from the chat line, please go ahead and read it.
No questions in the comment line, just some thoughts.
Okay.
So maybe if anyone has any question, now's the time.
Thanks, but there's lots of comments. So if anybody would like to come in and share the thoughts and observations, please. Yes, 𝗘𝗰𝗁, please come in.
First, thanks everyone for such a really fruitful information. So it's like, again, a person wants to say much more. We got so many papers, but only probably 1 second. But there is one thing I noticed maybe in the last decade, that there is an enormous big explosion of, I would say, personal and public and collective awareness. So, and I got a feeling that, there is so many ideas, there is such a strong development in the self. There is so many things, on the individual, but yet even on the local level and on the global level. So on one hand, I got a feeling that we need to a little bit breathe and allow the nervous system to integrate all these amazing informations. Because when I speak from an internal system of a personal, let's say, involvement, we humans need sometimes to just a little bit pause, to allow nature to integrate all this informations inwardly, to project them out. And I get a feeling that in a way, we really need to give ourselves a little bit a kind of, space and time to breathe. And from that space, like today here, share informations between each other. I think it's amazing. And maybe in this transitory phase, between the old and the new, to really, to collect, to share, to reflect to each other. But I think our nervous system really needs to integrate all these incredibly powerful informations that are changing us, are rewiring our complete, as I said, internal systems, family systems, social systems, and I can go global system, cosmic systems, and to maybe practice something called spaciousness. Because it seems to me with the whole global, fast-growing mantra we were constantly hearing, it seems to me, as I said, when I as a person don't give myself enough time to integrate all these informations, I burn out. And maybe now it's a good time to just, as I said, breathe in, breathe out, allow all these amazing informations to find their space. And from this space, like we do today, share. But as I said, a little bit, sometimes I hear it way too few times to stop and listen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, please, Heather, please come in.
I've really benefited greatly from this conversation, given the work that I do where I live. I live in a community where our elected county officials have declared publicly that there's no systemic racism in our community. So I live in a time and place where the battle is fully engaged around really around the legacy of racism and the Christian doctrine of discovery and dehumanization and domination in the United States of America. And in our local food movement here that I've been working in for 30 some years here, it's really in the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities where the real bubbling up of relationship building and trust building and trying to generate a parallel food economy and maybe even parallel systems of citizen action is beginning to happen. And as a white person of Welsh descent, my ancestors are Welsh. They were Quaker immigrants in the 1600s to the United States of America. It's been a challenge for me to create the kind of awareness spoken of here with the community of white environmentalists where I live. There's not this level, there's not this mindset in that community of people. And I speak to them from kind of a marginalized position in my community. But when working with the Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, there's a sense of beloved community and well-being and even celebration together after hundreds of years of oppression. So I'm just really wondering how this is going to put rocket fuel into my engines and help me to find a systems change leverage point that will really be effective. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for this conversation. It really gives me a sense of stronger ground under my own feet to continue trying to find ways forward here in a cosmo-local way. So thank you. And anybody who has experience with bringing the Brown, Black, Indigenous voices forward in their participatory or liquid democracy realms, maybe there's not enough time now, but I'm really looking forward to learning more about how to do that with love. How to just bring love. Who was it? Was it Jimi Hendrix said, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, there will be peace. I'm just trying every day to come from love, and some days it's really hard because the United States is a very harsh and brutal place right now, and it's getting worse.
Thank you, Heather, for your very open and heartful words and sharing your thoughts and experiences. And I'm glad that today's session brought a bit of hope to your plate as well. And maybe if you want to get closer to some indigenous wisdoms and how to bring them forward, we have this Year of Ubuntu, which is also part of the Ecocivilisation movement. And I see 𝗘𝗰𝟐 is with us. She's one of the driving forces behind this movement. And we also meet like every 2 months, and we go deeply into the wisdom of indigenous people. So feel free to join us. And anybody else would like to come in and comment? I see Herman with us, but I'm not sure if Herman is active or is just connected. So if Herman, if you're active, I'm inviting you to join us and maybe share some reflections.
And Dora has her hand raised.
Yeah.
And okay, Dora, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly, what I was wondering during these 2 hours now, that politics is so much about resource allocation, and that hasn't really been touched upon. Who has the resources? Who decides who has the resources? And if we are talking about democracy, and that means that people have equal rights, then shouldn't it be accompanied by equal access to resources, or at least a fair share of resources for, you know, like spread out evenly? So I was just missing that aspect from the discussion.
I think that's a very important comment, and maybe Uffe will
I have mine.
add his point of view. Please, Uffe.
Yes, it's a bit of a reflection about Dora's question, because, and I really don't know where to start, but if I should look into my experience from when I worked and established the Alternative Party in Denmark, the base was really, it was a very based initiative. And if I should look back and be critical and reflective on my own work, I have to admit that I took something for granted. I thought that the people involved had the same mindset as I had, understood leadership the way I did, and it ended up with, not going into too much into detail, but ended up with a very big power fight among some core people involved in the work. And what I learned from it was that maybe you think that you are looking out of the same value window. But if you start to talk about power and ownership and economic issues, then suddenly you understand that we are actually not looking out of the same window anymore. And so the question you raised, Dora, I think it's, for me at least, a key question about very tough power questions about, for example, ownership. Ownership to land, ownership to water, ownership to air, ownership to our democratic infrastructure. And for example, our young politicians, he talked about the social media platforms, and it's actually privatized democratic infrastructure. So you also have to raise the question about who owns our democratic infrastructure. So up to now we have been talking on one level, which has been very meaningful. But for me, I think there's some very vulnerable issues and tough issues about power. Yeah, I can have some opinion on that, but time is running out. And if I should just say one last statement, is that we're talking about the old and the new, and we are both the old and the new on a personal level. And we shouldn't be romantic about that. If we create a new space, then everything will be fine, because we are taking all our own old dramas with us into the new space. And to really understand that, our egos, our power plays, our desires, good and bad, etc., that over time, if we're not are dealing with it and understand all our ghosts, our own inner ghosts, then we'll end up in some messy stuff. So I'm happy that you raised the question, Dora, because I think that we haven't covered that in our discussion up to now, and we should do it.
If I hear both of you correctly, there is a new title emerging for one of our next calls, which is The Future of Ownership and Eco-Civilization. So I'll make a note of that, and we will find a space that we bring this on board. and I will make sure that we continue this conversation. As it was already said, we are already finishing today's session. I'm very grateful to all of you to be such a careful listeners, and I'm grateful for all of your comments in chat section. We have saved them all, so this will be used further in shaping the future talks. And what I can say at the end is just I'm very humbled in front of all of these challenges and questions and possible solutions. Very much encouraged that we can see forward, that this is not the end. We're not trapped in this old system of, as Alexander called it, brutalism. We are actually seeing a new vitality of the systems around us that is very much defined by 𝗣𝗁 properties, and a lot of new solutions will have to emerge also because there is no empty territories anymore. There is no lands to conquer with this imperialistic energy. We are called to sit together and to really think about our future engagements and the way how we would like to live, bypassing this most of the time brutal acts of dominance and ownership that have brought many negative effects now to our societies. So I'm glad we are finishing with an optimistic note that there is future emerging and we can co-create it. So thank you, 𝗪𝗻, thank you, Indra, thank you, Elke, Emma, thank you, Alexander and Stefan. I think we got a really nice and very exuberating, vibrating space within which many new thoughts emerged, and I can't wait to engage with all of you again. So next session, it's probably not by it will not caught you by surprise because we actually talked briefly about it during this session. It's going to be space, our next frontier. So we're going to look at possible relationship between us humans and the space explorations, and could that be our next common denominator where we can engage and bring a bit of more profound humanity to it. We need to hurry because right now this is the most brutal neo-capitalism happening in the space with a lot of damage being already done. But I think we still have time to maybe relate to it better with the understandings of consequences of bad behavior that we caused here on the planet Earth. So thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure and I'm honored to be with all of you. So go home or go out and enjoy your life. Be safe, stay healthy, and stay engaged. See you next time.
Thank you.
I will ask speakers to stay in the room for a few more minutes. So, but the rest of the participants, I would ask to disengage.
Can you stop the live broadcasting to Facebook, please?